Today, we shall talk about environmental ethics. Have you heard of the term Anthropocene? At the start of the 21st century, Anthropocene became an environmental buzzword. The term was actually coined by biologist Eugene Stormer and chemist Paul Crutzen in 2000. Well, the Anthropocene epoch is an unofficial unit of geologic time that is used to describe the most recent period in Earth's history, when human activity started to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. Well, the debate on whether we are there yet or if we are there, when did this start, is not of much importance in our discussion for today. But I mentioned Anthropocene because whether it is backed up by hard science or, mere pop culture, it is actually hard to deny that the human activities have been causing a lot of changes in the landscape of the Earth, climate, plants and animals around us, and even the way we humans live our lives. Of course, you can be Heraclitean about it and say, well, there's nothing unprecedented in all these changes that are happening. By the way, Heraclitus is a pre-Socratic philosopher who once said, you cannot step on the same river twice. His claim is that everything changes. The universe keeps on changing. Everything is in flux, pantarei. So if you're familiar with what the cliche, the only thing in this world that does not change is change, well, that's Heraclitean. And so you can opt to believe that, well, just like Heraclitus, there's nothing unprecedented in all these changes. So what is the difference? The changes that we have right now appear to be so drastic, they happen so fast. And second, they seem to be predominantly caused by one species alone, humans. And what is said to be, well, for the scholars, what is said to be more unique with what is happening is that we, the species, actually know that we are doing it, that we are causing the changes. So questions concerning how human beings do and should interact with the non-human world have long existed throughout the recorded human history. And since these are questions on how humans ought to act and relate with a certain X, then they become legitimate concerns of ethics. Ethics, however, for a long time, has been concerned primarily with the relationship among humans, relationship with our neighbors, our friends, our families, or in the vertical dimension, the transcendental relationship that we have with the divine, me and my God. In recent years, however, we realize the need for an ethic that will appraise our dealings with the land, the plants and animals, and all the other parts of the environment. Well, this is because we bear witness to the unprecedented anthropogenic changes in the environment, well, the possible markers of the Anthropocene, which have resulted in various ecological problems. Rivers are polluted, mountains flattened, we consume resources to depletion, climate change, among so many others. And as rational and reflective beings, we can actually make critical assessments of these problems from the frame of our moral relationship with nature. We don't make any assumption here that the non-humans or the non-human environment will be able to, enter a reciprocal, ethical relationship with humans. The non-humans and the natural environment actually lack the capacity of reflective thinking. They could not understand, much more act in accordance with what is right and what is wrong, what is good and bad. Well, as our dogs may not be capable of reflective thinking, we cannot expect them to act ethically around us. So when a dog bites a human, we cannot say the dog has wronged the human. But if the human bites the dog, well, that's another story. And that could be of ethical concern. That could be a very good subject of an ethical discourse. In other words, humans remain to be the moral agents here, making moral decisions. But now, since humans are reflective beings, it is expected that since they know how their actions affect the environment, then there will be a recognition of those who or which are somehow affected by their actions. Well, these are the moral patients. Moral patients are, in general, the things that are valuable and at the same time, well, vulnerable to human action in a variety of different ways. Well, it is environmental ethics then, that can actually provide the philosophical approach to this through a diverse set of religious, indigenous, cultural perspectives, and of course, the traditional ethical theories. Environmental ethics actually facilitates the application of the ethical perspectives and principles to environmental issues and problems as we continue to define human relationship with the environment. Well, I used to say this in the early 90s to my classes when I started teaching environmental ethics as a special problem in practical ethics. I used to tell my students, well, environmental ethics, is an emerging discipline in applied ethics. Well, these days, such claim is no longer true. Well, this is an area of applied philosophy that has gained a strong ground with its voluminous scholarship that continuously grows and offers developing theories and ways of understanding human relationships with the environment. So let me share with you an overview of environmental ethics, the literature in environmental ethics that was shared by Claire Palmer so that we can have a rough sketch of the historical development of this particular discipline. Well, I also took the liberty to add a few which I think are also relevant in accounting for the mainstream philosophical environmental ethics. It all started, I would like to say, with the work of Aldo Leopold, the father of the land ethics. Leopold was a conservationist, he was a forester, and eventually became an ethicist. He was distressed at the degradation of the environment and argued that we must begin to realize our symbiotic relationship to Earth so that we could value the land. Or for him, when he talks about the land, it does not only refer to the soil, but it refers to the flora, fauna, even the natural processes that goes on in the land. So by the land or the biotic community for its own sake. That we start to see ourselves not as conquerors of the land, but as plain members and citizens of the biotic community. Another monumental work was that of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This was published in 1962. And in the book, Carson actually warned us of the dangers of DDT, or the toxic pesticide residues, to humans and to wildlife. This particular work actually sparked the environmental movement that we know today. Well, shortly after, 1970, was the celebration of the first Earth Day. This was when, environmentalists got together and started calling for the preservation of the Earth. That was April 22, 1972. Again, a year after, the first environmental philosophy conference was held. Then, 1973, RNES shallow and deep long-range ecology movements actually was printed, and this introduced the theory of deep ecology or ecosophy, ecological wisdom, and it seeks the realization through oneness with things. So humans are not just part of nature, but humans, the species, are actually one with nature. So it's the oneness with things that Ness is actually advocating here. Again, the year after, it was the work of Peter Singer that paved the way for a new area in environmental ethics. 1975, the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. Ethical questions concerning the treatment of non-humans started to become part of the philosophical agenda. With Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, the utilitarian approach to the treatment of sentient animals was introduced and subsequently advanced the discourse on the ethical treatment of animals to achieve philosophical respectability. 1979, the first environmental ethics journal came out, and this actually published new influential collections on environmental philosophy. From the mid-1980s to the present, teaching, research, publication of environmental ethics have rapidly expanded, including publications from areas outside of the United States. 1986, Paul Taylor's Respect for Nature, another one that that introduced a new perspective in environmental ethics, which is the biocentric theory, came out. That was 1986. And 1989, the first International Society for Environmental Ethics was established. I have been part of this society for quite some time, having attended many of their international conferences. 1990, there were journals, many journals came out that would publish articles, works on environmental philosophy and environmental ethics. At the end of the 20th century, environmental ethics has already become a widely studied subject. Well, in the Philippines, many articles on environmental ethics were produced at the turn of the century. When I was scanning actually the local literature on this, I came across my small contribution, my old article that came out in 2002 titled From Capre to Ecological Conscience. Let me now bring you to the central questions in environmental ethics. These is not the all questions in environmental ethics, but these are questions that oftentimes you will encounter in your study of environmental ethics. One, what ethical theory may be applied in the study of the human-environment relation? Two, how do we value the environment? And where does such value come from? Third, do we promote an anthropocentric or human-centered environmental ethics or a non-anthropocentric ethics? Question on what ethical theory may be applied in the study of environmental ethics is our main concern here. The central question is actually on whether it is possible that within an ethical constituency so large that it includes the entire planet, if it is possible that we arrive at a single governing ethical principle or a set, at least of consistent ethical principles that may be applied to all ethical problems. Well, there are different approaches in an ethical theory building that could provide an answer to this central question. Ethical monism, ethical pluralism, environmental pragmatism are only some of them. So let's start with ethical monism. Remember the question on whether it is possible to have, such a comprehensive theory that can be applied to all sorts of environmental problems in the analysis of the different environmental problems. Well, ethical monism would advance the conviction that there is actually, and there could be, a single governing ethical principle that may be applied to all ethical problems. Of course, this is not acceptable to the other ethicists. They contested that no one ethical principle or set of principles can possibly perform such a comprehensive, such a gigantic task or function. So ethical pluralism was therefore offered in response. Scholars like Peter Wentz, for example, even offered a threefold classification of ethical pluralism: the extreme, the moderate, and the minimal. So for extreme ethical pluralism, alternations between different ethical theories may be used in the analysis of a certain environmental problem. So for example, if you choose the consequentialist or the teleological tradition, for example, utilitarianism in your analysis of the use of a single-use plastic, then that could be used in one context, in one problem. But in another problem that you will have to analyze, you may have to use, another theory. You may have to anchor your analysis on a different perspective. For example, the deontological tradition, the rights-based theory, that of Kant. And so you try to analyze problems in relation to performance of certain duties. Well, you do that in extreme ethical pluralism, an alternation of, the ethical theories in your analysis of environmental problems. The second one actually brings us to the moderate environmental pluralism. Well, in this case, it is pluralistic in the sense that it contains or it makes use of a variety of independent principles which actually could not be derived entirely or which could not be reduced entirely to a single master principle. So there may be in one problem, for example, you may be applying different ethical principles, but the ethical principles are not derivable or reducible to, one established ethical system, like, for example, utilitarianism or the ontological tradition, etc. So that's the moderate ethical pluralism. Now, in the minimal ethical pluralism, the moral theory use simply lacks the universal algorithmic decision procedure. So you use a variety of strategies that may not be derived, from any established ethical theories or principles. The third one is environmental pragmatism. Influential figures have advocated different ethical frameworks which may be applied to different situations. The environmental pragmatists simply advance the idea to get away from too much theorizing and just develop strategies by which environmental ethics could contribute to the resolution of practical environmental problems. Methodologically, this implies the acceptance of moral pluralism and therefore argues that environmental ethics is plural and contextual. However, environmental pragmatists seek ways in which the different ethical perspectives can converge in actual practice. Philosophically, taking off from the work of American pragmatist John Dewey, environmental pragmatism veers away from foundationalism and therefore the denial of the a priori or moral absolutes. It advocates what is central to environmental pragmatism, which is democratic public conversations about social values. Let's discuss, let's converse about this problem, and out of that, let's try to come up with a possible resolution. Another central question concerns the value theory. How do we value the environment, and where does such value come from? Well, generally, discussions on the valuation of the environment center on whether the environment has intrinsic or instrumental worth or value. So what's instrumental value? Instrumental value is actually the value that you assign or ascribe to something because of its usefulness as a means to an end. So when we say the environment has an instrumental value, that means that the value emanates from its usefulness to us. It serves as a means to forward our end. What would be good for us? So that's instrumental value. However, on the other side is the intrinsic value, which other environmental ethicists would like to advocate. Intrinsic value is the value that is assigned to someone or something that is pursued for its own sake, no longer because it is useful, not for expediency, but because in itself, by virtue of its existence, it is already intrinsically valuable or intrinsically worthy. So for those who advocate intrinsic value, there are those who actually believe that the intrinsic value is created only by humans. In other words, it's a human construct, Intrinsic value that is created only by humans, which they attach to their own lives, the lives of the other people, or particular state of affairs, or maybe, in this case, the environment. J. Baird Callicott would actually say, all values are subjective, human-created, anthropogenic, but they need not be human-centered or anthropocentric. In other words, even if the value is created by humans and attached to, the environment, these values need not be anthropocentric or human-centered. We'll talk about that in a little while. Now, the other group would actually claim that this intrinsic value is already there in existence. It was not created by human. It is something that simply needs to be recognized by human. And as mentioned by Holmes Roston, the value of the natural world has pre-existed before human beings, and they will continue even when humans become extinct. So this discourse becomes important as we approach the third question about perspectives. So let's now move on to the third question. Do we embrace an anthropocentric ethics, or do we embrace a non-anthropocentric ethics? The biggest debate may be in more specific approaches like, do we promote an anthropocentric or human-centered environmental ethics, or a non-anthropocentric one? Now, anthropocentric environmental ethics is the human-centered environmental ethics that actually holds, one, none but human interests matter. And simply stated, human interests become part of the moral consideration. In other words, when we make moral decisions regarding the environment or on an environmental problem, the moral consideration simply centers on human interest alone. Yeah, although the anthropocentric idea may not always command reckless exploitation of the environment, even when only human interests become part of the moral consideration, only human interests count in the moral calculus, still, we are not to always assume that it's a command to recklessly exploit the environment, because an anthropocentric perspective can only be construed in terms of, maintaining the soundness of the environment. We protect the environment because it is instrumental for human good. In other words, the environment is instrumental to human good. And therefore, as such, when we talk about, for example, managing natural resources, we say natural resources must be carefully managed for the good of humans. Well, this basically underpins most environmental policy making decisions, including, sustainable development. And so we try to manage, we try to protect the environment because we know that our sound existence and the planet basically depends on the sound existence of the environment as well. But mind you, the end of this remains to be the good of humans. So still, the human interest is what matters, what counts in this particular instance. Also, in the case of animal welfare, when we take care of our dogs, we feed our dogs, basically we do that because we love them. Basically, we do that because they give us happiness, pleasure. They comfort us in times or during times of stress and anxiety. And therefore, taking care of the dogs ultimately is for our own good, right? And because the environment is instrumental to human good, then we can assign it an instrumental value. Yeah, and so, with the anthropocentric perspective, we just say environmental ethics need not be anchored on a difficult-to-justify claim to intrinsic values. And to give us a better perspective on the anthropocentric perspective, then we say human beings, as the planet's most important and dominant species, can and should manage the planet mostly for their own benefit. Other species are seen as having an instrumental value only, that is, their value depends on whether they are useful to us. So, basic environmental beliefs of the anthropocentric perspective include the following. We say we are the planet's most important species and we are in charge of the rest of nature. So that means we're the masters of the universe. We are the leader of, the rest of the creation. We are the planet's most important species. That's the assumption. Also, anthropocentric perspective would claim that there is always more. No? It seems like there is an assumption that the resources are infinite. The assumption that if one part of the environment is lost, it goes extinct, then maybe technology could pave the way for the replacement of such. There is always more. Third, along the anthropocentric grounds, all economic growth is good. More economic growth is better, and the potential for economic growth is essentially limitless. Our success, therefore, will depend on how well we can understand, control, and manage the Earth's life support system for our benefit. How well we can manage, how well we can control the life support system of the Earth for our own benefit. And of course, it says human actions are only problematic when they have damaging implications for humans. So this anthropocentric instrumental valuation of the non-human natural world has been attacked by various groups within the circle of environmental ethics that forward the recognition of their intrinsic value. Remember, for the anthropocentric perspective, the value of the environment is only instrumental, means towards human ends. And so, on the other side of it are those environmental ethicists who would advance that the environment, instead of the instrumental value, do have the intrinsic value. On the other side of the fence, we'll see the non-anthropocentric perspective. But even within this group, we find that there are varying views. One holds the environmental individualism, and for the other group, the environmental holism. Now, both of them would advocate that the non-human parts of the environment actually do have intrinsic value, as opposed to the instrumental value claimed by the proponents of the anthropocentric ethics. So on one side of the non-anthropocentric proponents are those who advocate environmental individualism. So this will include those that promote animal welfare, animal liberation, rights. We'll talk about this later. But this would also partly include those who forward another perspective, which is biocentrism. So within this framework of environmental individualism, we will see that they actually are giving premium to the individual interests of every organism, to the individual interests of the species, no? Maybe based on several criteria that are actually being used to make them part of the moral community. So it is recognized that organisms do have their interests, and because they have their interests, then that interest should count in the moral consideration. That should be part of the moral calculus. And along environmental individualism, they would actually make use of certain, criteria so that the organisms would become part of the moral community. So one perspective would actually call for consciousness. The other one would call for sentience, or the ability to, suffer. So organisms that are sentient or have the ability to suffer would be and may be made part of the moral community. Or for some, the ability to flourish. Or for others, the simple possession of life, simply because these organisms are alive. And so, by virtue of these criteria, they now become part of the moral community. They are now being accommodated as part of the moral community, and as such, their individual interest now counts. On the other side, however, are the proponents of environmental holism. Environmental holism includes those of those who advance the idea of ecocentrism, and also that of the land ethic. Recently, some would actually call this ecological ethics, no? But the difference in environmental holism is that they give premium not on the individual interests of the organism, rather on the interests of the ecological whole, the interests of the whole community, no? And therefore, in the determination of whether the action is good or bad, right or wrong, they would now look at the what would be good for the entire community, what would be good for the ecological whole. Well, I guess the land ethic of Aldo Leopold would give us, the best idea about the holistic, this holistic view about environmental holism. When Aldo Leopold said, an action is right if it tends to promote the beauty, the integrity, the stability of the whole biotic community. Hence, the premium is being placed now on what would be good for the entire community, for the entire ecosystem, instead of, the claim of environmental individualism, which is just the good of individual organism. Differentiation between the anthropocentric versus the non-anthropocentric perspectives oftentimes compare the anthropocentric with environmental holism, ecocentrism, or ecological ethics, as some would call it. We have seen the basic beliefs of the anthropocentric perspective, so let us now take a look at the basic assumptions of the ecocentric perspective or the ecological ethics. What does it say? Human species are part of and not apart from. Remember, for the anthropocentric, human species are the conquerors. No, they are the dominant species. But here, human species are part of, not apart from, the community of life and the ecological processes that sustain all life. An individual is therefore a member of a community of interdependent parts. Well, among the basic beliefs of the ecocentric perspective are this. 1, nature exists for all of the Earth species, not just for humans. You can now see the big difference. Second, the claim that there is not always more. The recognition that maybe our resources are finite. Now, third, some forms of economic growth are environmentally beneficial and should be encouraged, but some, which are environmentally harmful, should therefore be discouraged. And in the case of humans, our success in the planet, therefore, depends on learning how to cooperate with one another and with the rest of nature by learning how to work with the earth. Remember, in the anthropocentric perspective, the success of humans would depend on how well we are able to manage and control the environment for our own benefit. In this particular case, we are being told that our success as species would depend on how well we'll be able to work with one another for the protection, for the conservation of the planet. The debate on these perspectives and questions continues, and this has made the discourse on environmental ethics richer and deeper as we continue to question and find ways on how to address the changing environmental problems.